Let's talk about image animations. What we are going to make will look something like this. I can click on a button and we have a star. If I click on the button again, the star disappears. The important part is that we have an animation for this star. To create something like this, you already know most of the steps. If you can import images and animate widgets, you know the basics. Although there are some problems. Let me go through them. Number one, for these kind of animations, you have to import a lot of images. So far, we may have imported 1 or 2 images. For this one, there are going to be a lot more. That very neatly brings me to the folder structure. This one looks like this. We have one Python file. This one contains the program we are going to make. Other than that, we have 4 folders and all of them contain images. For example, inside of yellow, we have a whole bunch of stars. What we're going to do is we're going to play one star after another, and if we do that fast enough, we have an animation. In case you're wondering here, the first image is only white because Windows is weird. The image here is actually empty. Going through the images is actually not that hard. We just have to configure a button. What is much more important is how can we import all of this? I guess you could write 30 import statements, but that would be kind of a pain because we also have other folders. We have the black folder, here we have a black star, then we have a dark folder, in here we have another kind of animation, and then we have the light folder, here's one more animation. If you were to import every single file manually, you would have to write a lot of code, which means I want to find some smarter way of doing that. For part number 2, we have to organize state management. This is going to toggle if the button has been pressed and goes forward with the animation, or if the button was already pressed and we have to run through the animation backwards. While doing that, we also have to make sure we are preventing interruptions. So what happens when the user is pressing a button while the animation is playing? In my case, I'm going to prevent any kind of button click. Other than that, it's just basic animation logic. So let's have a look. In my case, I am relying on custom tkinter because this one is slightly more complicated. But all of the logic would also work for TTK. The reason why I'm using custom tkinter is because, well, it looks much nicer. And if you can use this with custom tkinter, you can also use it with normal tkinter. Other than that, I'm importing from PIL image, so we can have images. Then we are creating a basic window, and we are running main loop. The result is going to look like this, a basic window. To stay consistent, one thing I forgot is the comment to say run before the main loop. Now for the button, I want to have a dedicated class. Class, let's call it animated button. For this one, I'm going to inherit from CTK button. I forgot this CTK first of all. This is the button we want to work with. So far, I only really inherited from frames, but you could inherit from any widget and add specific bits to it. In here, we want to create a constructor, so a dunder_init method. This one needs 4 arguments in total, or well, parameters. Self, as always, then we need a parent. After that, we need a light path and we need a dark path. Those are for the light images and the dark images. Because remember, in custom tkinter, when we are creating images, we have to account for a light and a dark theme, which means you always need 2 kinds of images. I guess if you want to be lazy, you could have the same image for the dark and the light image, but that wouldn't look as good. What we have to do in here, first of all, is run the super dunder_init method. The master is going to be the parent. Besides that, we want to have some text. What you put in here really doesn't matter. Let's say a button, or rather a animated button. Once we have that, we can place the entire thing using the pack method. Or well, any kind of layout method here is fine. I'm going to use pack because it's easy. With expand being true, the button is going to be right in the middle. With that, I can create the animated button. I can add in the window as the parent. Then I need 2 paths. Although for now, I'm just going to add none and none because we have nothing for the paths. If I run this now, we have an animated button. Although this one doesn't do anything right now. That is bringing us to the first part that we really have to care about. We want to write a method that imports a whole folder, or rather folders. Because what I want to do in here is I want to add self, then I want to have the light path and the dark path. The argument I'm expecting here is a path to a folder. So if I reopen the folder again, we have the Python file here, and what I'm expecting is, for example, yellow, or black, or dark, or light. Any of these folder names is what I'm expecting. Just to be explicit here, I want to have, for the light theme, I called this one black. For the dark theme, so the second argument, I want to have yellow. Once we have the actual images, we can play around with the colors here, but they all work in the same way. In here, we have to figure out how to work with that. First of all though, I want to loop over both of these paths, which is very easily done for path in then a tuple with the light path and the dark path. If I print the result, path, while also making sure that I'm running this method, in the init method, self.import folders with the light path and the dark path. This method needs to be run before the super method. That is really important. You will see later on why. Although if I run this now, we get black and yellow. Now we have to figure out how to get the folder contents from this path. For that, we are going to need another module. That module is called OS. However, I don't just want to import OS. Instead, I want from OS import walk. What walk is doing is if you give it a folder name, it gives you the content of a folder. For example, what I could be doing, instead of printing the path, I can print walk and then the path. If I run this now, we get a generator object that didn't go as planned. But if you convert this thing to a list, then you can see what's going on. This is looking much better. Let me extend this a tiny bit. We are getting two lists. This list here for the light path and this list here for the dark path. You can actually see for the first argument, we are getting black and we are getting yellow. Those are the folder names. For each list, there are actually only 3 arguments. The first one is the folder name. This one we don't care about because we already have that. Next up, we have an empty folder for both of them. If there were any subfolders inside of these folders, the names of these folders would be in this list. Since we don't have any subfolders, we can entirely ignore this one as well. It's simply not relevant for us. However, afterwards, we have a long list with all of the files inside of this folder. This is what we actually care about. On top of that, you want to be aware of the order here. In my case, I'm starting with 000, 0001, then 2, 3, and so on. On some operating systems, I think in particular for macOS, this order might be messed up. I'm going to show you later how to account for that, but it's definitely something you want to be aware of. It can mess with your animations quite a bit. Although another really important thing to mention is that what we are getting in here are just file names. All of these are strings. They're not files, they're not images. We just get a string of a file name. We still have to do the actual import. But that comes later. First of all though, I want to add another for loop. For, let's call it data in walk path. The result is going to be, if I print the data, we have the stuff I've just shown you. Although we can be a bit more elegant here. Since this walk path is returning 3 things, we can unpack them right away inside of the for loop. We get the folder name, we get subfolders, and then we get the, let's call it image data. All we care about is image data. This is what I want to print. So if I run this, we get all of the image names. To indicate that I don't care about the folder name, I will replace this one with an underscore. The subfolder I also don't care about, so this one is going to be a double underscore. Next up, the image data. If I print this again, we absolutely have to make sure that this data is sorted. It always has to start with 0000 and end with 000 and 29, with the numbers going from the lowest to the highest. You might get this by default, you might not, and you really want to make sure. For that, I want to create a new variable. I'm going to call it sorted data. In here, we want to use sorted. What I want to sort is the image data. But to be a bit more specific here, I want to set a key. Because if we just passed in the image data, let me show one entry. I want to print image data and then the one with the index 1. Also, let me comment out this bit here so we're not getting an error. If I just print 1, we get this bit here, and this is a string. If we use this with sorted, Python wouldn't really know what to do with it, because if you compare different strings, it's not really clear which one is smaller and which one is larger. Instead, what I want to do is only get the last 5 digits. If I then turn this into a number, Python can sort it from the lowest to the highest. And obviously, if you have different file names, the logic here would be different. It very much depends on what kind of system you have. In my case, I created these with After Effects, and this is the default name, so I can't really change that. Let's first of all only get the number here with this one item. We first of all have to get rid of the .png. That we can do using the split method, and I want to split this wherever we have a dot. Like so. If I run this now, we are getting a list with 2 items returned. I only care about the first one, which means I can use indexing here to only get the first one. With that, we get image and light 0001. Since we can do indexing on strings, we can use indexing here once more. I want to go from -5 all the way to the end. If I run this now, we are just getting the number itself. Although, if I print the type of what we are getting, we are still getting a string, which means we have to convert all of this to an integer, and now we are just getting a number. You can see we're getting a number because Python removes all of the zeros, which means this logic here is what we actually want to use. Let me uncomment sort it, put this over multiple lines. Now for the key, I have to use a lambda function. The lambda function will always get one, let's call it item. This item is now going to be my image data, which means I can copy all of this, paste it in here, and replace image data with item. Then I can comment all of this out, fix the white space here. On top of that, we have to remove this one here. We only use that to get one item from the image data. This we don't need anymore. Now if I run this, we're not getting an error. That's a pretty good sign. But just to be sure, let me print sorted data. The result is still going to go from 0 all the way to 29. Although now, I think if you are on a Mac, the result here should now be a properly sorted list. With that, I can get rid of the print statements, this one, and we have sorted data. This is still not enough, because now we need the full path. You might be wondering now, don't we already have that from this image data? The answer is not quite. Let me print it actually again. If I print sorted data, what we get is a file name, but this is not a path. What we have to do instead is, first of all, for the full path, we need the folder name, then plus, then a slash, and then we need the image name. Fortunately, we have everything we need. The image names we are getting from this list here. The folder name is either light path or dark path, which we are getting from the path. Although, since we have quite a few of them, I want to store all of this inside of a list. Let me change full path to full path data, and now we are going to use list comprehension. I first of all want to get the path. This is either light path or dark path. In our case, this would be black or yellow. After that, I want to add a slash, and then I want to add one of these file names. I guess we can use item again, so I want for item in sorted data. With that, if I print the full path data, we are now getting actual paths. We go into the black folder, and in there we have image 000, then black image 001, and so on. This is what we actually need. Although we have to get all of this out of this for loop, so we can use it a bit more efficiently. For that, I want to have another variable. I'm going to call this one image paths. This for now is going to be an empty list. And once I have full path data, I'm going to append that. Image paths.append full path data. With that, after we are finishing the for loop, let me minimize it actually. I want to print image paths. This is now going to give us 2 long lists full of image paths. The first one is all of this, and the second one is all of this. This is a good start, but I want to modify this a tiny bit. Ideally, I'm going to have a list. Let me draw it here. Inside of this list, I want to have lots of tuples. Each tuple should contain one dark image path and one light image path. So one in here and one in here. Then I want to have another tuple with two more of those. So that would be this image here, or this image path, and then this image path here. I want to assign a new value to my image path. The value I want to assign is zip, and then I want to unpack the image paths. Let me print actually what we get. This might be a bit complicated. Image paths, what we now get is a zip object. That's not particularly helpful, but we can turn this into a list, and now we can see what's going on. What we're getting now is one long list, and this list is full of tuples. One tuple contains the first image for the dark image, so black image 0, 0, 0, and then the light image, so yellow image 0, 0, and 0. Then we have another tuple here, and this continues forever. We keep on having more and more tuples. This makes it very easy to work with this data, which is exactly what I wanted. Also, in case you're wondering here, zip is a function that zips together two lists in a way that you take the first item from the first list and the first item from the second list, and then you combine those two into one tuple. Zip is expecting two arguments, which should be two lists, which we get by unpacking image paths, because this one contains two lists. With that, we have all the data that we need, so now we can turn all of this into actual CTK image objects. Those I also want to store on a list, so we're going to continue by creating CTK images, which is going to be another empty list. We are almost done actually. This is the much easier part. What I want to do now is for image path in image paths. Let me print what we get, image path. We are simply getting a tuple with the light images and the dark images, or however you want to call them. The naming here doesn't matter terribly much. What I want to do with that is I want to create a CTK image. This I do with CTK and CTK image. This is what we need in custom tkinter to store image data. Inside of this, we need a light image and we need a dark image. Since in my case, the first item inside of the image path tuple is the light image, this is what I'm going to assign here. Which means we can now use image.open and pass the path in here, which would be image path 0. I should probably put all of this over multiple lines, otherwise this will be difficult to read. We are using image open on the first item. Now we are doing this on the second item as well, or the one with the index 1. Once we have that, all we have to do is get CTK images and append the CTK image. With that, we are going to have one long list with all of the CTK images. This is what I want to return. So return CTK images, then we can close this method and never worry about it again. And this was by far the most difficult part of this tutorial. If you got so far, the worst part is definitely over. Once we have the imported folders, I want to store the return value inside, let's call it self.frames. Just to make sure this is working, let me print self.frames, and we are getting a list of objects. This doesn't tell us very much right now, but at the very least we are getting something. I guess you can tell here, we are getting CTK images, so that's a pretty good sign. Once we have that, we need actually to create a bit more stuff in here. So let me create a proper section that I call animation logic setup. Besides the frames, we also need what I call a frame index. This by default is going to be 0. Later on, I'm going to explain the animation logic. But for now, this is what we're going to use to pick one item from the frames that we want to display. We can actually already use this. When I'm setting up the button inside of the init method, I can also add an image. This image is going to be self.frames. And since this is a list, I can use indexing. I want to get self.frameIndex in here. And once again, this should be over multiple lines, otherwise I'm cutting off some text. If I now run this, there should be an image. You can see there's an empty space, but nothing more. The reason for that is that the first image is completely empty. This is why you can't see it. However, what we can do now, if I change the frame index from 0 to, let's say, 20, now we can see 1 star. If I increase the number to 21, we get a slightly larger star. If I go to 26, okay, this is going to be very hard to see. But if I go to, let's say, 4, we get a very small star. The differences between these images is so small, it's really hard to see if you see them by themselves. For now, just trust me, this is definitely working. Next up, we need self.animation length. This is going to be the length of self.frames. Although from that, I want to subtract 1. The reason for that is, imagine if we had a list right now with 3 items. The list would be 0, 1, and 2. This would be 3 items. However, if I want to use indexing, it would always be the length minus 1. The final item would be the length of the list, so 3 minus 1. This is going to be really important for this animation length, because I only want to go up to this final item, but then I want to stop. So I have to know what is going to be the final index of the list, which I'm going to call length. It's not exactly accurate, but I think you get the idea. There's one more thing that we need, and that is self.animation status. This is going to be a tkinter variable, or more specifically, a ctk string var. This one is going to have the value of start by default. Now, why do I want the animation status to be a string var? Well, the reason here is because with that, I can use tracing. So self.animation status, and I can use trace. And anytime I'm updating the value, so I'm writing in it, I want to run a certain kind of method. This method is going to be animate. Let's create this one right away. I want to have animate. What is important here, besides self, we also need unpacking and args. Because every time we are using trace, we get some default arguments. Although in our case, we don't really care about them. For now, I'm going to add pass in here, because there's one more function that I want to create. That is going to happen inside of this super init method. Because I only want to start the animation when I'm clicking on the button, which means this one needs a command. The command function is going to be self, and I call this one trigger animation. I'm going to create this one above animate, so trigger animation with self and nothing else. In here, we are going to do state management, which means we are updating animation status. For example, if self.animationStatus.get, which would right now get us start. If that is the case, so if this is equal to start, then I want to set self.frameIndex to 0. So we are starting on the first frame of all of the images. On top of that, I want to set self.animationStatus with the set method to forward, which basically means that we want to start at 0 and move the animation forward. Besides that, I also want to check if self.animationStatus.get is equal to end. If that is the case, I want to get self.frameIndex and set this to self.animationLength. Other than that, I want to set self.animationStatus with the set method to backward. Since with this, we are updating the tkinter variable with forward or backwards, this animate is going to be triggered. Now, we can check for different things. For example, what I could be checking for is if self.animationStatus.get is equal to forward. If that is the case, I want to play the animation, which in this case means I want to get self.frameIndex, frameIndex like so, and increase the value by 1. Which means that this number here, self.frameIndex, when we use it first time, gets the first image, which we are using down here with the image. This I want to increase to 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way until the end of the animation frames. If I go through them fast enough, we are going to have an animation. Which means I can use this now with self.configure. I want to update the image. The image is going to be self.frames. In here, self.frameIndex. Let me run this actually. If I now click on the button, we get a very small star. This is because we are only calling this animate once. So we only go from frame 0 to frame 1. We will need self.after. After 20 milliseconds, I want to run self.animate again. With that, if I click on this now, we have an animation and then we are crashing. Since we are running this method here forever, at some point we are going to run out of frames. Or more specifically, we have a larger index than the length of the list, which is giving us the error. Or more specifically, we get list index out of range. To account for this, we need an if statement. If self.frameIndex is smaller than self.animationLength, only then do I want to update all of this. If I try this now and click on the button, we have an animation. That's looking pretty good. If that is not the case, so else, I want to set self.animationStatus using set to end. That is telling us once we get to the end of all of this, I want to have a new status because I know the animation has finished. If we're then pressing again, this if statement here would run and we would set the animation status to backwards. By now, this wouldn't do anything because inside of animate, we only have this bit of code here. Meaning we're only running any kind of animation if the status is forward. To account for that, we need a second one that checks self.animationStatus.get is equal to end. If that is the case, I want to do very similar things compared to what I've done here, although not exactly. Let me start by copying it. And now I want to set self.frameIndex and reduce it by 1 every time we are calling this. Configure still works just fine. Although for this if statement, I only want to do all of this if self.frameIndex is greater than 0. This part is still fine, although in the else statement, if we are finishing the animation, I want to set the status back to start. If I'm running all of this now, I can click on an animated button, and now we are almost done. The animation works, but we always go to the end and then back to the start. The reason for that is that we only want to do this if the status is backward. Now if I run this goes forward and now nothing happens, but if I click on it again, we're now going backwards. This I can do multiple times, it still works just fine. On top of that, when I'm creating all of this, I can get CTK set appearance mode and switch all of this to light mode. We are now getting a different kind of animation, or well, the same kind of animation, just different colors. If I open the folder again, we are importing yellow. This is the dark images. This one is all yellow. And then black has the same animation, just in completely black. Although besides that, we also have dark. This one has a heart animation, either for white or for the dark path. Which means if I add in here light and dark, we are importing those folders. And now we get a heart that we can also animate. Although I think this should be the other way around, dark and light. That is definitely looking better. If I remove the appearance mode, I guess it kind of works. Let me stick to yellow and black. I think those look a bit better. Although I had this the other way around earlier. This was black and yellow. There we go. Now we have the yellow animation again. Cool. With that, we have made a lot of progress. Although there's one challenge I have for you. I want you guys to create another animation, and this one should run forever. That means we go from frame 0 all the way to the end, once we reach that point, we're going back to the start, and then once again, we go from 0 to the end. That way, the animation will keep on starting over and over again. Try to implement this one. I want to keep all of the logic contained inside of a method. I will call this one infinite animate. No need for custom parameters. This I also want to trigger when we are pressing the button. To check if this is working, let's print infinite. If I now click on the button, we get infinite. That's a good start. Now we have to figure out the logic. For that, self.frameIndex and increase it by 1. Once I have that, I want to use configure again. I want to update the image. The value is going to be self.frames with the index of self.frameIndex. Finally, I have to run self.after. I want to update this after 20 milliseconds and call self.infiniteAnimate again. If I run this one now, we get the first animation, but then we are crashing because we are running out of list indexes again. To account for that, we need one more line of code. Basically what I want to do, I want to update self.frameIndex and I want to set it to 0 if self.frameIndex is greater or equal than self.animationLength. However, if that is not the case, else I want to keep self.frameIndex as self.frameIndex. The way you want to think about it is if we have a list with 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 items, self.frameIndex is going to start here, then it's going to jump to this one, then to this one, then to this one, then to this one. And if we get to this point here, this if statement is going to trigger, and it is going to put self.frameIndex back to the start. That way, the animation will go on forever. Let's try this one now. If I click on the button, we get a continuous loop. Although, I think because of the equal sign here, we are skipping the last frame. Let's remove it and play this again. There we go. You can't really see a difference, but, well, there's one more frame in the animation now. And with that, we have animations. Obviously, you can make all of this a lot more fancy, but this should be a really good start.